ambitious Wall Street financier.
Joe conducted himself in every way as a master of the universe.
With a dark secret.
He was like living this whole separate life.
A glamorous bad girl with a penchant for rich and dangerous men.
We wanted to be bad girls, but not too bad, you know, a little bit bad.
Joe and Diane Pikul were living the New York high life.
High society, the limousines, the fancy restaurants, the Hamptons.
Until Diane mysteriously vanished.
The last words to me, I remember, I can handle it, don't worry.
A high-flying New York power couple rises to the top on a tide of greed and ambition and drowns in it. Tonight, on Power, Privilege, and Justice.
October 19th, 1987. The stock market crashes, killing the money-mad 80s in a single afternoon. 4 days later, Diane Pikul, beautiful, glamorous, and rich, is on her way to her summer home and another argument with her estranged husband, Joe. Before the week is out, her body will be found 250 miles away at the bottom of a drainage ditch along the New York State Thruway. Who had killed her? The answer would send a chill from Lower Manhattan all the way out to Long Island's trendy beach community, the Hamptons.
Joe and Diane Pikul were a New York power couple, a high-flying money manager and his glamorous wife. They seemed to have it all, but their lavish lifestyle masked a tale of perversion and madness.
New York City, the capital of money, fashion, glamour, and success. People come from all over the world to try to make it in New York. Some dream of making it big on Wall Street. Others to be accepted by the in crowds, the artists, the socialites, the rich and powerful. Joe Pikul, a poor kid from Massachusetts, dreamed of both. Joe grew up in the Polish working-class neighborhood of Ware. His father, a weaver at a local mill, drank and had a violent temper. He left scars on Joe, not all of them emotional.
He would later tell people that he had a very abused childhood, that his father was an alcoholic, and beat him so severely that on one occasion broke his jaw.
Despite the abuse, Joe excelled in school, learning at an early age to conceal his most intimate feelings.
In high school, he did fairly well. He was on the football team, glee club, a very good student, went to a 5-year program at Northeastern University, where he graduated with high distinction, which is equivalent to magna cum laude.
At Northeastern University, Joe met and married Sandy Jarvinen, a sweet and submissive girl. Joe was dominant, confident, and in Sandy's eyes, charismatic. In 1960, the couple moved to New York City, and Joe went to work as a money manager on Wall Street. It was the beginning of the 60s stock boom. Joe was in the right place at the right time. The hours were brutal and the pressure intense, but his hard work paid off. By the end of the decade, he was a multi-millionaire. He often traveled to Europe by Concorde to check out stocks firsthand and was celebrated in the financial press for his business savvy.
He was a self-made man, a strong-willed man, a man who trusted and kept his own counsel above all others.
He was a wheeler-dealer in stocks in the stock market, noted for his very aggressive trading.
But what made for success in business caused pain at home. Joe bullied and abused Sandy and often drank to excess.
One occasion, he hit her on the head with a statue, and she fell down a flight of steps unconscious or semi-conscious. Woke up, got herself together to get into a car, and then just fled.
By the early 70s, Joe was caught in a dangerous downward spiral. He and Sandy divorced. He was overextended financially, and fellow brokers complained that he was often drunk and disorderly at the office. One day, when a limousine driver came to pick up Joe, he accused the man of having an affair with Sandy. When the driver denied it, Joe pulled out a gun and pistol whipped him.
There's no question that Joe Pikul had an extremely volatile temper. The cab driver incident is just one of many in the course of his life where this guy would snap and go ballistic at anybody and everything that got in his way.
With his divorce from Sandy, his financial woes, and his drinking problem, Joe clearly needed help. In April of 1976, he entered Alcoholics Anonymous near his apartment in the West Village.
I'm very familiar with the Perry Street AA. I went there myself every day for a couple of years. At Perry Street, Joe found himself surrounded by artists, writers, and intellectuals. One of them was a beautiful yet troubled young writer named Diane Whitmore.
Diane grew up in a wealthy Indiana family. She was an only child who dreamed of life in the big city, of writing, art, and lavish parties.
She was just a fascinating woman. She was hilariously funny. She was gracious. She was interesting and intelligent.
In 1965, Diane graduated from Mount Holyoke, an exclusive women's college. She set off for New York's famous Greenwich Village with two ambitions: to become a writer and to get rich.
She was looking for, you know, a post-college, post-Midwest experience that was full of glamour, edge, poetry, bohemianism, a hint of violence, which is something that always attracted her, and she was quite frank about that.
She spent the next 10 years experimenting with drugs and a series of volatile relationships.
One of the things that drew Diane to men who were not good for her was that she wanted to do anything to change the script of the nice girl getting married, having children, living happily ever after.
But after a decade of trying to find herself in New York, Diane was divorced, drug-dependent, and a recovering alcoholic. She desperately needed a change in her life. She hoped to find that change in AA, and she did. She met Joe.
He had a dark side, clearly, and she was attracted to the dark side. At the same time, she wanted to, at that point, be a rich man's wife, and she got both in this one package, and it was a very, incendiary package.
She was gorgeous, she was funny, she was sexy, she was talented. He was not a particularly handsome man. She probably knocked his socks off. And I also think, sadly, that he had the eyes of a predator, that he sensed that he could get her.
Just a few months into their relationship, Diane became pregnant. 2 months later, on July 14th, 1978, Diane and Joe were married.
When Joe and Diane walked down the aisle, they thought they were walking into a fresh, new beginning. But their marriage would turn out to be a big mistake, a deadly mistake.
By the early 1980s, Joe Pikul's fortunes were on the rise again. Diane stayed at home, caring for their daughter Claudia and infant son Blake.
When they got married, they were both in recovery. They were both working very hard on themselves. They were very, very invested in being the very best parents that they could be.
Joe adored the children. The family moved into an historic apartment in Greenwich Village. They wore designer clothes, had round-the-clock babysitters, and owned an expensive summer house in the Hamptons.
The Hamptons had long been the exclusive domain of old money families and potato farmers. But let's face it, new money always wants to be where old money is. And by the 80s, the Hamptons were an irresistible draw for people like Joe and Diane Pikul.
With its oceanfront properties and trendy scene, The Hamptons was a favorite getaway for the rich and famous like Calvin Klein, Christy Brinkley, and Paul Simon. The Pikul's Amagansett retreat was at the edge of this rarefied world.
It was an upper middle class, 80s affluent life. The kids were in private schools. She had a decorator for both her village apartment and her Amagansett house.
Diane was living the high life she had always wanted. She and the children spent summers in the Hamptons. Joe stayed in New York during the week and took limos out to Amagansett on weekends. To an outsider, it looked like the Pikuls had the perfect life.
They were the couple who had everything. And I think everybody assumed that it would go uphill from there.
But the joyride would soon come to an end. Joe's dark side, his volatile temper, and his sense of superiority would soon reveal itself.
Joe truly felt above the rules of society and was an utterly headstrong individual and conducted himself in every way as a master of the universe, as a person above it all.
As with his first wife, Sandy, Joe wanted to completely control and dominate Diane's life. But Diane wasn't like Sandy.
Diane was a very feisty woman. It was a relationship where two people were edgy and they were looking to bring that out in the other. It's hard for a woman to win in a relationship like that, but she was not a doormat.
He would throw the ball at her, and she'd throw it right back at him, and their fights would escalate.
Joe's most vicious tirades usually had to do with the way he thought Diane was raising their children.
He felt that she spent too much time away from the home and that she would use babysitters, a lot of daycare.
He thought she was an unattentive mother. He didn't like the way she was raising his children. Also happened to be her children. They had bitter fights about it.
By early 1987, after nearly 10 years of marriage, it seemed Diane could do nothing right in Joe's eyes. The couple rarely shared a bed, and Diane began to suspect that Joe was having an affair with another woman. But she was about to uncover a far more disturbing secret about her husband. While searching through the attic in their Greenwich Village apartment, Diane made a shocking discovery. She found suitcases filled with women's lingerie, some of which was her own. She also discovered videotapes and photographs of Joe dressed in drag.
I think he was sleeping with men. I think he was cross-dressing. Yes, he was leading a double life.
Diane was disgusted and profoundly disturbed.
And she starts screaming at Joe, "Stop stealing my underwear, buy your own clothes." And she really confronts him with this whole knowledge that he's a cross-dresser.
Diane placed a desperate call to Manhattan's top divorce attorney, Raoul Felder.
I don't think he was leading a double life. I think he was leading a triple life. He had a life at the office where he's a successful bond trader. He had a life at home where he abused Diane. And then he had the third life as a cross-dresser.
But Diane knew that if she kicked Joe out, he'd take his money with him, and she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. She gave Joe's videotapes and photographs to her lawyer and began to plan for a life without Joe.
Armed with the videotapes, the pictures, and Manhattan's top divorce attorney, Diane seemed to hold all the cards. But what she didn't know was that the deck was stacked against her.
While Diane tried to keep the marriage together, Joe secretly began recording their arguments and hired a private detective to spy on her.
We would go out to dinner, and there'd be somebody sitting at the table across the way watching us. And Diane would say, "That's the detective."
Meanwhile, Joe was becoming even more eccentric. He rented a secret apartment in Battery Park City and filled it with women's clothing and lingerie. One night, he blindfolded the children and led them to the apartment, warning them not to tell Mommy about Daddy's secret.
The thing that triggered and set off alarm bells in my head was blindfolding children and taking them to another location. And that's when I told her, "Let me get you an order of protection, let's kick him out."
Frightened but determined not to leave Joe until she was sure she could make it on her own, Diane took a job as an assistant at Harper's Magazine.
It was a sort of a glamorous job. At Harper's, she was seen as the sort of wonderful, glamorous personality that she was, and at home, she was being abused. So it was an escape for her.
Diane also enrolled in a creative writing class and began writing short stories.
She wanted to improve herself. She wanted some self-worth. She felt that for too long, her only purpose in life had been to serve Joe.
But seeing his wife develop an independent life outside his orbit made Joe even angrier.
Joe didn't like her working. Joe wanted her to be there every minute, you know, like on call 24 hours a day.
Just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, on Monday, October 19th, 1987, the stock market crashed. It was the biggest single-day point drop since the Great Depression.
As his marriage is unraveling, his personal life is unraveling, Black Monday hits the stock market. And he loses so much money that he knows he's dead, he's gone.
3 days later, Joe met with his ex-wife Sandy at the World Trade Center's Windows on the World restaurant. He asked her to become the legal guardian of his children if anything should happen to him, or if Diane were to have an accident. At the same time, Diane was making plans to leave Joe and take the children with her.
She was doing everything she could to get out. She was looking for another place to live. She had done all the things that you're supposed to do when you're in that kind of situation. She had money put away. She had bags at friends' houses. She knew about the shelters.
Joe and Diane both knew their marriage was broken beyond repair. So that Friday, they drove to Amagansett in separate cars with a plan to divide up their belongings before putting their summer house up for sale.
We were supposed to have dinner that night. And I called her up that afternoon, and I said, "Are we going out to dinner?" And she said, no. And she told me that, you know, she was going out to Amagansett so that she and Joe could divide up property. And I remember thinking, what?
They were going out to settle up their affairs. And it was one of those situations where she clearly should not have gone.
I remember walking out of the hall, following her, basically being a nuisance, and her last words to me were, "Don't worry, I can handle it."
In a movie, this is where you'd shout out, "Don't go in that room." But it wasn't a movie, and no one would be able to save Diane Pikul.
After Joe and the children got to the house in Amagansett, Joe put the kids to bed. When she finally pulled into the driveway at 1 a.m., Joe was waiting. The next morning, when the children asked where their mother was, Joe explained that Mommy and Daddy had fought and Diane had disappeared. He told them that they were going on a road trip upstate. He rushed them into the front of the family station wagon. In the back of the car was a large and mysterious bundle. First stop, the Amagansett hardware store.
What he asked for was like rope, wheelbarrow. He bought a shovel, he bought tarps, he bought trash bags, cleaning supplies.
Joe paid the bill, nearly $400, and went next door to buy 12 bags of ice, refusing to let anyone near the station wagon.
I wanted to put all the merchandise that he bought into the car, and he was like livid that do not put this in my car. I don't want you putting anything in my car. Just put it outside the car.
With the car fully loaded, Joe and the children headed upstate. On the way, Joe called an old college friend to ask him for a favor.
Where he reaches out to his college roommate, hasn't seen the guy for more than a decade, and says, "Can you watch my kids for the weekend?"
After driving 150 miles north to drop off his kids at his friend's house in upstate New York, Joe drove another 200 miles to his ex-wife Sandy's house near Boston. When he finally arrived at 4 in the morning, Joe, acting crazed and desperate, told Sandy he had something to bury.
At first she thought this was some sort of financial transaction and he just needed to hide something. He said, no, I really want to bury it in your backyard. As the conversation goes on, it becomes more clear to Sandy that he's talking about burying Diane.
Joe admitted to Sandy that he had killed Diane and that her body was in the car. When Sandy refused to help him, he headed back to Manhattan.
Joe Pikul had now spun completely out of control. I mean, this was a man who was once celebrated as a Wall Street whiz kid, and now he's asking his first wife if he can bury his second wife's body in her backyard.
48 hours after he murdered his wife, Joe Pikul awakened in his Greenwich Village apartment. Joe's children were still upstate with his college friend, and his wife's body was still in his car, parked on a side street just around the corner. He called his children's schools to report they would be absent. Then, he got into his car for the 2-hour drive upstate to pick them up. But first, he had to dispose of their mother's body.
As he approached the Newburgh exit, there was a pull-off on the road. And I think he realized that this would probably be the last chance that he had. He pulled off, he looked down in a drainage ditch, and he just said, I got to get rid of it, and put it at that location.
Joe was just a few miles away from picking up his children when he pulled Diane's tarp-wrapped body out of the car and dragged it 30 feet down into a drainage ditch.
I always thought that for such a smart, intelligent man who was very successful in the professional world, that it was very strange that he would dump his wife's body in a place where she could be easily found.
After picking up his children, he drove to the Stewart Auto Wash in Newburgh, New York.
He looked like he'd been like with days without sleep. His hair was a mess, you know, his clothes were all wrinkled. He really looked, you know, like he was in rough shape.
Joe ordered the works, the $9 super wash, and was especially concerned that the back of his car be cleaned thoroughly, saying he'd pay whatever it took.
There was a sunken area in the back of the car, and I climbed down in it to clean it. And I was down inside of it cleaning it. He just kept coming back and asking me how messy it was.
While his car was being cleaned, Joe told anyone who would listen about the fight with his wife.
And he started telling me how his wife had left him and that she ran off with her lover and he found condoms under the bed. And then he just had to get away for a while, so he took the 2 kids and they just took off upstate.
When Joe and the kids finally left, nearly 3 hours later, workers at the car wash checked the dumpster where Joe had thrown a number of items away.
They found a knife. They found a lot of women's clothing, large size clothing. And they found high heels that they had to be size 11 in men's. That's how big they were.
They thought the situation was strange enough to notify the local police, who came to the car wash at once.
As soon as I seen the knife and the rope and the women's clothing, I became very suspicious.
He threw away a picture of his children. And to me, I have a son of my own with the blonde hair and the blue eyes. And that just bothered me for a minute. Why would you throw away that?
It had now been 2 days since anyone had heard from Diane Pikul. Her friends suspected the worst.
The minute that I heard that she had not gone to work on Monday, I knew she was dead. I knew it, and I knew he had killed her.
At 10 a.m., Bill Glynn of the New York City Police Department received a call from one of Diane's co-workers at Harper's Magazine.
She kept insisting that she was very, very concerned about Diane's safety. Her concern was that Diane was being held captive in the basement, out in the house that they owned, out in Amagansett, Long Island.
But not long afterward, Glynn got a call from Joe Pikul, playing the role of the concerned husband.
I just wanted to let you know, he said, I had an argument with my wife, he said, out in Amagansett, Long Island. He said he was looking for his kid's shoes under the bed, and he found a condom under the bed, and the condom didn't belong to him. So he confronted his wife about it. They had a verbal altercation, and she walked out the door. And she never returned.
Joe promised to call Glynn if Diane didn't show up by nightfall. The police then decided to set a trap for Joe. He got a call from someone claiming to have found his credit cards in a dumpster at a car wash in Newburgh. The caller, who identified himself as John Clancy, was actually Newburgh detective John Smith.
In the beginning, he was fine until I started mentioning credit cards, wallet, things of that nature. He became very, very nervous, started stammering. I thought he sounded like he had marbles in his mouth.
Joe sent his limo driver to pick up the credit cards in Newburgh, but when he got there was no John Clancy waiting. By this time, the Newburgh police had traced the credit card address to Manhattan's Greenwich Village. They alerted the NYPD.
I says, I don't know what's going on here, but I explained to him that I was going over to meet this fellow.
Around midnight, Detective Glynn headed over to Joe's apartment to take a missing persons report.
Pikul struck me as a little strange here. I felt at that time he was trying to cover something up, but I didn't know what. I said, well, are you concerned that, you haven't seen her in 24 hours? And he said, nah, she's done this before. He said she'll eventually show up.
The next day, the New York State Police searched Joe and Diane's home in the Hamptons.
Right next to the residence was a cemetery. Our first thought was that she could possibly be buried there. So while we searched the inside of the residence, we used dogs and we did a foot search of the cemetery to see if there was any recently disturbed earth.
The cemetery search came up empty. But at the house, they found something that seemed to back up Joe's story.
Our ID section did find a condom under the bed and secured that as evidence.
But the next day, the police got a call from maintenance workers on the New York State Thruway in Newburgh.
I received a call from the barracks saying that there was a body on the thruway, that there was a dead female discovered alongside the thruway at milepost 56.5.
It didn't take police long to identify the body as that of Diane Pikul. An autopsy revealed that she had been severely beaten until she was unconscious, then strangled to death. When police went to question Joe at his home, he was gone. Not only that, they soon found out his money was gone too.
We developed information that he was withdrawing large sums of money from his bank accounts. He was a very affluent individual. And we were concerned that he was going to try and leave the country.
Finally, on Thursday, October 29th, 5 days after the disappearance of Diane, Joe Pikul was arrested at his lawyer's office in Manhattan and taken to police barracks upstate for questioning. Detective Joe Tripotto was in the car.
He was constantly talking about this Diane, how nasty she was and how he thought she had boyfriends.
To keep him talking, Detective Tripotto took Joe to the morgue to see the body.
And Pikul looked at her, and I specifically looked at him to see, looking for some big reaction. He looked at her and he just said, that's her.
Joe was then asked to undress so police could check for drugs or marks on his body. Pikul violently objected.
I said, Joe, you're going to strip. We want you to take your clothes off, and if you're not going to take them off, we're going to take them off you. So he said, okay. And he took his clothes off, and as he took his clothes off, we seen why he was reluctant to take his clothes off. And he had a woman's bra, he had pantyhose, and woman's panties on.
When Tripotto noticed cuts and scratches on his side and hand, Joe was ready with an explanation.
He said he did it with the kids, playing with the kids.
By now it was late. Joe was tired. At midnight, Tripotto asked his final question.
I asked him, how'd you do it? And he actually put his hand just like this as to choke. And I said, you choked her? And he said, he shook his head, yes.
Now, 6 days after strangling his wife, Joe Pikul, millionaire stockbroker, was officially charged with murder. Bail was set at $350,000. It was now January 1989. Diane Pikul had been dead for more than a year. Although her husband Joe admitted to police he strangled her, he claimed it was in self-defense. To handle his case, Pikul hired high-profile New York defense attorneys Stephen Worth and Ron Beckoff.
This was going to be a very interesting trial indeed. It was Joe's word and his money against the state's evidence. And to make matters more bizarre, Joe had remarried. His new wife was a Manhattan fashion designer named Mary Bain.
He showed up in my office one day during the summer with her, introduced me to her, and we chatted for about an hour. At the end of that, he said, well, what do you think? Can I get married? I said, Joe, I'm against it. He said, why? I said, listen, if we bring in another woman who you are now married to, they might say it's a motive. He walked out of this office, and 2 days later, I got a call they were married.
How any woman could come to the, become so intimate so quickly with an individual accused of killing his wife. I mean, it was mind-boggling to me.
Because Diane's body was found in upstate New York, the trial was held in Goshen, a sleepy little town 2 hours north of Manhattan. The location put Joe's big city legal team at a disadvantage.
We kind of got the feeling that we were playing an away game, and clearly the feeling was that that Joe, certainly, if not all of us, was a slick, successful New Yorker, the very stereotype of urbanite that upstaters don't like.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
On January 26, 1989, jury selection ended and the trial began.
It was 11 men and 1 woman, and we were thinking, you know, oh boy, are these guys going to understand a Greenwich Village woman? You know, are they going to just say, you know, she kind of deserved it?
Joe's lawyers would go out of their way to appease the small-town jury, but they couldn't control Joe's new wife, Mary.
We go there the first day, and Mary shows up with Joe, and they're coming in holding hands, and she's in a full-length mink coat. I grabbed her before we went in the court and said, Mary, I don't know what's in there, but they ain't gonna like the full-length coat. You can't come in there with the full-length coat. She said, okay. She took the coat off, hung it up. Next day, Joe came in by himself. I was relieved. But an hour later, when everyone was in there and no one was there to stop her, she walked into the court and sat there the whole day in a full-length mink coat.
Before the trial even began, Joe's high-priced attorneys requested private meetings with the judge to keep potentially damaging testimony out of court. First and foremost, the jury would never hear about Joe's affinity for women's underwear.
Can you imagine what it'll do to a jury? You get a grandmother or a school teacher, and all of a sudden they hear someone cross-dressing. They're not used to that, and it'll strike them as odd and probably hold it against them.
But the prosecution wasn't worried. They had plenty of evidence to build their case.
It was clearly not the perfect crime from the outset. We wanted to present everything that was said by Pikul to the jury in order to paint the full picture of what happened.
In their opening statement, the prosecution took the jury back to the early morning hours of October 24th, 1987, when Diane arrived at the couple's vacation home in the Hamptons.
He had confronted Diane Pikul, accused her essentially of having an affair or cheating on him. He said that she in turn was raising her voice to him and that he lost control and choked her to death.
On the witness stand, Detective Tripotto described the chilling moment when Joe confessed to strangling his wife.
He looked at me, and he took his hands, and he went exactly like that. I said to Mr. Pikul, I said, you choked her. He shook his head, yes.
I looked at him for a reaction, and he looked at me as if to saying, well, that's what happened.
Prosecutors then presented evidence showing that after he killed her, Joe put Diane's body in the car and drove it to Little Albert's Landing, a nearby beach where he tried to bury her but couldn't. Frustrated, he left her there overnight. They claimed he came back the next morning, wrapped his dead wife in canvas, put her body in the station wagon, and began his journey upstate with his 2 young children.
He had a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old, and we believe they took an extended trip from Amagansett down on Long Island to New Windsor, which is at least a 3.5-hour trip, with the body inside the vehicle.
Methodically, the prosecution presented the rest of their evidence. Diane's belongings at the bottom of a car wash dumpster. Her body found along the highway just 5 minutes away. The beating Diane suffered before being strangled. The prosecution was confident they had an airtight case.
We had a statement from the defendant that, in fact, he had choked his wife, and we had very strong circumstantial evidence to establish a motive.
But throughout the trial, Joe seemed strangely unconcerned. The prosecution couldn't help but wonder what his lawyers had up their sleeve. They would soon find out. The defense planned to call Joe himself to the stand to testify on his own behalf.
In a murder trial, putting the accused on the stand is a risky move, and most defense attorneys flat out refuse to do it. Putting Joe Pikul on the stand would prove to be riskier than anyone could have imagined.
We built our defense knowing full well that we were going to win or lose this case on whether the jury liked Joe Pikul, whether they believed Joe Pikul, whether they felt bad that he caused the death of his wife.
If Joe faltered, he was a dead duck. But Joe's lawyers had been rehearsing him for weeks, and they were confident that he could pull it off.
But on the morning Joe Pikul was scheduled to take the stand, he didn't show up.
The next morning, 9:30, no Joe Pikul.
Step up. Step up. Step up.
5 minutes before 10 or thereabouts, he staggers into the courtroom with Mary. She's saying he's drunk, he drank a whole bunch of vodka last night.
The defense scrambled to try to get the trial adjourned for a day.
And he denied my motion. He says, you have an hour and a pot of coffee. Sober him up and let's go.
So, just before noon, Joe Pikul took the stand.
We spent countless hours just going over the story and over the story and talking about his mannerisms. Some days, he was so good, we were on the verge of tears. And the Joe Pikul that testified was just rambling, drunk. And he started out poorly, very disappointed. He almost made me want to drink.
Testimony that you said that she deserved. Possibly you said that?
Yeah. She was a bitch and cheated on me right from the beginning. I wanted my children. I didn't want them with her. And also, she had tried to kill me.
When he testified at the murder trial, it was like, it was a ridiculous, I forget exactly what the defense was, but it was, she came at me, it was an accident, you know, I mean, it was a very worked out, these two attorneys must have really worked very hard to figure out how this could have looked like an accident.
To back up Joe's story, the defense showed photos of a cut on his side, saying Diane attacked him with a knife. This was the same cut that Joe initially told police he'd gotten while playing with his kids.
The most startling thing about Joe's story was that it just was so preposterous that it was like no one could imagine the jury buying this thing. I think at that point everyone just figured this guy's sunk.
I don't think the jurors bought it for a minute. If there was nothing else that pointed towards his guilt, I think that would have done it. Because it was just, he was obviously lying.
The very next day, the jury announced they had reached a verdict.
We were playing hearts in the jury room, and we got word there was a verdict. We went back there. I looked at him, and he said, good luck. I said, me? Good luck to you, Joe.
Will the jury find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree?
We do.
Is that a unanimous verdict?
Unanimous verdict.
They found him guilty. He went like this. I lean over and he whispered. He says, I'm sorry. I messed up. I shouldn't have drank.
I think he was shocked. I think he was living in his own world. never expected it.
But Joe was not ready to give up. A few days after the verdict, Joe's new wife, Mary, brought his attorney an audio tape of an argument between Joe and Diane.
The tape was of Diane Pikul, the deceased, telling Joe, I don't care. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to stab you with a kitchen knife, and I don't care if I go to jail or not. Well, I just finished trying a justification, self-defense, where we were saying she came at us with a kitchen knife, and now I'm getting her voice saying she was going to do it. I was beside myself. I went and I told the judge, and I said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to make a motion to set aside the verdict. He said, okay, you can do that.
But Bekoff never got the chance to file the appeal. On June 2nd, 1989, Joe collapsed in his jail cell.
As I was preparing the motion, I get a call. Joe Pikul's dead. I thought it was a joke. I said, you're very funny. I called up there, and sure enough, he died in the Orange County jail.
An autopsy revealed that Joe Pikul had died of complications related to AIDS. Ironically, his death enabled his attorneys to clear his name. In New York State, if you die before you are sentenced, the conviction is vacated.
Because he hadn't been sentenced and the appeal process hadn't been exhausted, technically, he wasn't convicted of the murder.
After a funeral at St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Greenwich Village, Joe was buried in an unmarked grave in the cemetery next to the Amagansett house where he killed Diane. 6 months later, his conviction was officially erased from his records. In the eyes of the law, Joe had become an innocent man.
Despite all the money he spent on his defense, it was Joe's death that secured his innocence. As far as New York State is concerned, he died with a spotless record. But Joe Pikul is not an innocent man. He brutally murdered the mother of his children, and somewhere, perhaps, he's paying for it. For Court TV, I'm Dominic Dunn.